Good. How are you?
Good, thanks.
Great.
Hey guys, I'm Araya. I'm sitting here with Ando and the very only James.
Lovely to meet you guys.
How
Welcome.
are you, James?
Yeah, good.
Good. Thanks for being here.
My pleasure.
So I guess we'll just give you a little bit of a chance to tell us about yourself.
Oh, okay. Background for me. All right. I started off my music career years and years ago, back in the 90s, running nightclubs and stuff down in Melbourne. Ran a couple of clubs, one Elysium, used to do Fridays, Plastic and Fridays down at the lounge there. And then managed to get a 5,000 square foot warehouse right next to Richmond Station and ran the mad ass parties and stuff like that, while also helping out and doing a lot of murals and stuff as well, with the Berserk crew and a few of those people. Every picture tells a story, hardware and stuff like that. And basically then decided to do my own thing, running warehouse parties, and that turned into maybe things going a little bit south on my career, and moved up to Queensland and started, had a bit of a hiatus for a while, and then essentially started doing stuff up here in sort of the mid 2000s or 2010s, 2000s. Mm-hmm. And from then about 2009, 2008, got involved with Heliport Studios, which was a new studio that had just been built up here. And Alan, the guy who just built the studio, he built it for personal pleasure, I suppose, and wanted to be a rock star himself, always been into guitar and stuff. And basically he'd built this studio with, I think it was the third incarnation with the console, and they just installed a Duality, which was the latest offering from SSL or Solid State Logic, and it was basically an evolution of the J series and the G series and the K series, which they just uninstalled, and which SSL have been around since probably 1976, and basically got the name. We're competing with Neve for sort of the top consoles that were used in big studios across the planet. Neve was obviously Rupert Neve, and SSL, they were Solid State Logic, and then were bought out by Peter Gabriel from Genesis fame, and also Peter Gabriel Sledgehammer. And basically they'd brought out the Duality, and about that time is when I got involved with Heliport. They'd installed a 24 channel, and Alan had sort of built it for his own thing and, didn't know much about it. So I said, look, I'll get involved. And it was a massive learning curve for me. I can definitely tell you some horror stories about back in the day when basically there was only two Dualities in the country, I think it was. There was one SAE in Sydney, I think it was, and one up here. And basically they were so new that the old SSLs used to have a button sort of for everything, so you'd have your auxiliary switches and your inserts and all your channel strips and all the normal stuff that a lot of people see on plugins these days. And I had this console that had serial number 121. There was only 120 of them on the planet, and this is the 121st. And I'd be trying to learn how to use it, and it was all button combinations instead of normal buttons. And numerous times I'd press two buttons or the wrong buttons together, and I'd be without sound for like 3 days, like losing my mind, thinking, "Oh fuck, I've destroyed this console. It's worth $500,000." And and then we sort of started Heliport and managed to get Heliport to a point where it was doing pretty well, so much so that we built a second studio. The beautiful thing about Heliport was it had 4 spaces essentially. Had a vocal booth, it then had a medium ISO room, the main room, and then you could use the kitchen also for recording, and then you had the control room. And we were basically the only studio around sort of southeast Queensland before another studio called Lush got started that basically could live track a whole band. We could do a full 5-piece. That's when I met you, Ando. We were, I got him in as you were originally playing for a band to start with, and then eventually you became a session drummer. Mm-hmm. And basically a bit of a growth. Then 2010 it must have been. The global financial crisis was going on, and a really famous studio called Sound City, where everyone would probably know that, Nirvana recorded Nevermind and Rage Against the Machine was recorded there, Fleetwood Mac Rumours. all of that, and they were closing down, and so that's when the studio was doing quite well. The Australian dollar was at parity with the US dollar, and then I bought a whole lot of equipment. I bought some amazing, like a stereo pair of 160s, a stereo pair of LA3As. We also I managed to convince Alan that the studio was going well enough that we needed 48 channels on the consoles, so we bought a 24 channel bucket from Ocean Way Studios in New York and got it shipped over, which is a bit of a thing, and I think it might even still be on the Heliport Facebook page if it's still around. I think it's been shut down actually now. But I've got photos of us installing it, and I got the benefit of learning a massive amount of, I also got taught by a guy named Tony Byrne, rest his soul. He used to run a studio in Brisbane called Sweet 16, and he'd actually physically hand soldered Sweet 16 back in the days when it was all soldering. Now it was all, you know, you had D-subs and stuff like that hooking up consoles, but yeah, really got to know the ins and outs of putting together a console because we were installing the bucket. And then around that time, Mick Wordley from Adelaide, who was running another studio in Adelaide, he was also an importer, he was bringing in two Studio A827 tape machines, the 2-inch 24 tracks, and one went to Sydney, and we managed to snag another one for about 10 grand. And it was only later that I think I've told you this story, but it was only later, like after about 10 years, a decade of Heliport running, we had that tape machine. We went to sell it after COVID. We essentially closed Heliport down. And yeah, I said to Mick, just out of interest, I've always thought this comes from Sound City. You know, in 2010, I was buying heaps of other equipment from Sound City. You know, I've been telling people that it might have the, you know, pedigree of coming from Sound City. And he's gone, no, that came from Dr. Dre's studio. And it was basically one of the tape machines that essentially Eminem had, you know, recorded his stuff on with Dr. Dre and the like. So I could have been telling people that for 10 years, which would have been a much better sales pitch, although Sound City was a pretty good sales pitch either way.
Yeah. Did you guys use that tape machine much?
Yeah, mainly for drums. Mainly because the way tape works with drums, we got a whole heap of 900 stock that I think we got from Music Lab before Music Lab closed down. Those are the days when Billy Hyde was still around. And yeah, we do first generation straight to tape to get that really beautiful, cohesive, saturated sound on the drums and all the rest of it. And I definitely learnt, when I started the studio, I was very, very, what's the word? I'd come from digital, and we all know the digital distortion is terrible, and spent my time trying to avoid digital distortion. But then getting into the analog world, this is a bit more of a foray, and I was definitely learning on my feet. And I'd had a couple of producers in. One was Cal Tanoma, who'd done all the 28 Days stuff, and he did the Mavis stuff in the 90s. And he was hiring the studio for the day, and I was there so just to be an assist. And he was cranking the console up to like 11, because it literally went to 11. It was almost the Spinal Tap thing. And all the equipment, you know, he's absolutely smashing the fuck out of them. I'm going, dude, it's in the red, and it's in the red. And he's gone, bro, it's an analog studio. It doesn't sound good unless it's in the red. So, you know, and that's when I really learned the value of, you know, going to analog. And the same thing with tape. You know, tape saturation, you don't get tape saturation unless you're driving in. So we had some really nice 900 stock, and that basically we'd then get a couple of, you know, nice bits of tape. I'd always try and convince any band that were coming in to do an album that they buy their own lot of tape, basically, because then you get first generation, you wouldn't get any tape degradation. And we do drums straight to tape and then bounce that back into Pro Tools, basically into the HD system. And we just basically manually do it by running a click on on the 24th channel, essentially, so I could then line it up. Because there was talk of getting a clasp system, and we did all that, and clasp had just come out at the time. And yeah, basically, it was just easier to go first generation in, record the drums, and have the band, you know, tracking, and they wouldn't get the latency. You'd probably get the latency in the control room, but I'd only have the tape on monitor, on the drums on monitor, and then you'd basically bounce it in, manually line it up again, and you'd get a pretty good result. So going to tape 24 channels is, yeah, pretty good. Yep. And then, yeah, obviously, you know, we had a lot of plugins and stuff, tape saturation plugins, which are still coming into their own, basically, when, you know, Waves and Universal Audio were all doing that. We'd probably, you know, we'd maybe do a couple of vocal takes. It just got too hard to do vocal takes than when you're doing, you know, 48 vocal takes for a vocal and stuff. And you didn't mind having a clearer vocal, but it was the drums that really mattered going to tape.
So you've obviously done a lot of bands and that through Heliport, but you have your own studio at home, and I know you, from experience, you did a lot of your mixing from home as well. What would you say is the biggest difference, aside from gear, working from a home studio to working in a big studio like Heliport?
Yeah, it's funny you say that actually, because it was funny. Like at one stage, and I don't know, many people get to say this. I mean, obviously 301 and stuff, but at one stage I could walk into the control room and there was retail, probably about $1 million worth of gear in there. We had LA2As and all the rest of it. But yeah, this was the time then Universal Audio were coming out with plugins that were really starting to oversample and sound like it sounds so much like the real thing that I found. And it was almost a bit of a waste because when I first started doing mixing, I was originally mixing in the studio, and we had a number of problems with that, mainly because the control room wasn't perfect. And then when we built the second studio, Studio B, we actually got a proper pro in, John Sayer, rest his soul. He died about 8 years ago. He was an amazing studio builder, and he was building them all across the planet. And when we got him in, he was doing a $10 million studio in Dubai, and it was like 3 levels and stuff. And basically, we then got in Studio B. It was a much better room, and in fact, one of my friends of mine, Andreas, he was the first client in there to mix do all the demos for that Towards the Sun film that Rihanna was in. So he was mixing all the Rihanna stuff, and he just thought the room was amazing. And so we then had a look at trying to get a mix set up in there, and SSL had just come out with the Sigma, which basically is a summing mixer that has basically got the brains of the SSL console that we're using, the Duality, in Studio A. And it got to the point where you could basically rely on the mixes you were doing in Studio B a lot more than you could in the Studio A stuff, even when I had all this equipment. And there was things like, you'd get splash off the console, which is a pretty common thing for a big studio. I then got some micromains in. I got them hand built by Thomas Barefoot, and got those in, and they definitely helped. But it did get to the point where, like, I'd then, set up my own. I bought the house 2 doors up and set up my own mix studio using John Sayer's amazing template for building a mix room in my place, and I bought a Sigma as well. And it got to the point where, yes, you knew you had this amazing 48 channel console that you should be mixing on, and it's all the analog stuff. But as far as convenience, especially when you had, you'd be doing a mix and you'd send it off to the client, and the client always inevitably has revisions. And if you're mixing in a large format console, in a large format studio, and you've got a mix on the board, and then you essentially, you've done the mix, you've sent it off to a client, and then the next day you've got someone coming in and track another album, and you've got to then change that whole, console to suit whatever you're tracking with, because tracking setups are so much different to mixing, And so it became a real hassle because, SSL had what's called total recall, where you could see on the screens where everything was, but you'd be manually setting all the knobs back to what they were. And then if you had to retrack something like, overdubs or something like that, you'd have to put it all back again. Whereas this Sigma, especially my mix room, I ended up using my mix room for basically just any of the albums going forward, because you'd have all the analog summing of essentially an SSL unit using the Sigma. We were running into a G-Bus compressor, which was the ultimate compressor at the time. But I'd then use UAD plugins, and I'd be able to, tune with Melodyne and do whatever else I'm doing in there. But it's instant recall, basically I'd have my settings that were set up on the Sigma. They were usually about plus 10 dB on every single channel. I was running 32 I/O, essentially, so 32 channels ins and out. So I'm basically mixing on a 32 channel console. And the same thing though, clients could call you 5 days later and they'd go, oh, can you do this on the mix? Can we just have the vocal up a bit or whatever? And they hadn't got back to you in time. And in a big studio, you'd kind of need to do it before the next job came in. Whereas this, I could literally pull it all up, make the tweak, and it became so convenient because you'd still get the sound, you'd still get all the, analog saturation that you're looking for, but at the same time, you had that recall ability, which is, the reason why people mixing in the box today still do that, and thankfully plugins have come a lot further. They're, miles ahead from what they were. They're not as crunchy, This is the time when we were going from 32-bit operating systems to 64-bit. It was the time then when, Pro Tools started bringing in 32-bit float. Which is a definite tip if anyone's ever going to record. Always use 32-bit float. Most DAWs don't come standard with 32-bit float. They come standard as 24-bit 44.1. But I've done so many shootouts, and 48K 32-bit float is definitely the way to go. It also means you basically can't clip it because it's floating. You can't clip and get the digital distortion that we all hate, but you can still mix and get amazing, plug-in and analog emulation distortion, plus, if you're mixing with a Sigma or any other summing box, you've still got that analog distortion too. So, recallability was definitely what it was all about.
Yeah, and so in your experience working at Heliport over a decade, wasn't it, that you were there?
Yeah, 15 years.
Yeah, so in that time period, did you notice any change in the volume of artists coming through in terms of, was there more local artists as time went on, or?
Yeah, look, unfortunately, it was also a real pity about what's going on with the music scene. I mean, we're just coming off the back of the whole Napster saga and the fact that, iPod had brought out MP3s and people were pirating them. There was the DAW revolution that essentially, yes, more people were able to do stuff in their homes and demo that way. And then, it was sort of the start of the end of the old, of the big studio essentially. And I had lots of mates that were working in big studios around the planet and were coming in here. But yeah, there was definitely a change. I mean, we tried to really do the price point that we were getting the local artists and getting them in. But, for them, so much of it was out of reach. Like the music scene's always tough at grassroots level, and yeah. But we still tried to do our best to, make it budget-wise. But yeah, it's very hard with a big studio when you've got overheads. Yeah. I mean, our base load was $600 a day, and that was before I got paid a cent,
Yeah. There was obviously, I did a few sessions there with a few local bands, so there was some coming through, but it was definitely the bands that I was doing sessions for were definitely more financially affluent than a lot of the other bands that I would do gigs with around the coast and things like that.
And there was a lot of them that wanted to have come in. And look, we did a whole lot of things that would try and make that easier, like as far as arrangement and ergonomics, like we'd try and just basically track drums on one day or, drums and guitar on one day and intensively do them in sessions. So, yes, it's nice to be able, I was pretty fast though. I mean, if we were setting up a live band, a live 5-piece, I'd be up and running by 11:30, and that's with everything sound check. We'd be doing our first take by then. And I was a big one one thing I noticed about when we'd often have a lot of the more hardcore sessions, like we had Troy who just left Amity and was, he was doing a lot of the more hardcore bands. They'd always demo everything in the DAW and they'd program the drums, and you always noticed, I hope this doesn't get played to Troy, but you always noticed by the end of the day that, essentially, if they were sort of stopping the drummer at each take and go, dude, get that fill right. And by the end of it, you could hear by the end of the track, the drummer's getting more tired. I was a very big focus on when we live tracked a band, we tried to get the takes as much as possible, what they were doing with the band and the magic together. That's what was, one of the things that was our shtick, if we could do it. Because, you do get kind of demo-itis, especially if you're trying to emulate a drum track and you don't get some of that magic at the same time. Mind you, that's the way the big albums and the big labels did it. So, that's kind of how it happened. But yeah.
So does that bring you back to kind of modern day, present day? What kind of happened with?
The biggest pity about not having a big studio anymore, because you're right, I do still have my space. I've converted a shipping container and the like, but I can still do guitars. I've still got, still got my Neves and still got, my compressors and distressors and stuff like that can, you can do vocals really easy. You can do guitars pretty easily. I'm still, and you've got your amps and stuff like that and bass obviously, but it's always the drums, the magic of the drums, especially now the tape machine's gone and stuff like that. The magic you could get on a tape machine with some of those takes were great, and we had a lot of fun getting some good sounds. But yeah, that's what's really changed. Mind you, I also think the difference of a live band jamming together, if you can get that, which you don't usually get when someone's producing in their own studio and, basically just working mentally on the mix. Remember we had this big discussion that, if you're going to program drums, you've essentially got to be a drummer or at least be aware of it, because you don't want to be putting the snare and the hi-hat and the kick all at the same time, because that's not how you play.
Yeah, okay. And so in terms of studios, there's obviously a number of studios on the coast.
Oh, well, there is now.
Yeah.
There wasn't to start with.
No. But have you worked at any other studios? Has it only been Heliport and your home stuff, or on the coast?
Oh yeah, not as much on the coast. No, I haven't. I haven't really done much other stuff. I mean, because I had the keys to Heliport, it was just always too easy just to do that. It was, it's my beast. But Yamanui sort of popped up after, as we were sort of closing down, and as I mentioned, Lush was further down towards Brisbane and a few of the others. And there was, Dave at Volt, who was around when we started. But I've had a look at doing sessions at other places, but it's a far cry from, like, someone had originally set Heliport up, and so it took me a while to set it up so it actually worked for other people. They could understand when they came in, because, engineers tend to set it up how they like it, and that's not necessarily how you want it to be. And especially when you've got, 48 I/O, if you don't set up your defaults right and all the rest of it, next thing you know, like the way I was originally set up, you had A16, B16 and C16, I think it was, and that was just really complicated. So I had to set up the default so it just went 1 to 48 and made it really easy kind of thing. But yeah, I don't think I did many other sessions at other studios, which, yeah, I mean, obviously apart from my ones, but yeah.
Yeah. And what about live performances? Have you done much live sound for?
Yeah, I did a whole lot of stuff for Woodford, and I've done a fair bit of live sound here and there. Did stuff for Noosa Surf Club and stuff like that, but that's all. I always find live sounds very, very different from studio sound because you've got to get a perfect sound in the studio, whereas live sort of near enough is good enough. You whack a compressor on the master bus and, you spend your time pulling out frequencies that are feeding back, and that's about it.
Yeah, okay, yep.
Not saying anything against live sound, guys. They're great.
And so, with the live stuff that you've done, is there anything that you've noticed? Like, how have you noticed the scene progressing over the years?
There was a couple of really big things. One of the things I did notice, and we were just talking a little while ago about Soul Bar. Soul Bar, the acoustics when it first started was terrible, and they used to say, it needs to be full to get the right acoustics because you're one of those bodies deadening the sound essentially. But they did a lot of. I do think people started to notice the acoustics in the rooms a lot better and started dealing with that a lot more. We gave a number of different venues a bit of advice on how best to do that and create bass traps and stuff like that, and treat the room. I think that definitely came into as a factor. That some of the venues just used to sound terrible. I think also some of the tricks, like Aaron, he used to do stuff for Soul Bar and stuff like that. He was a bit of a magician. He knew how to build amps and he knew the nature of amps and really knew his microphones and stuff like that. Hence the reason why he ended up going to at the church and the like. And but yeah, he and a few others really started making the sound improve. I think Wave started bringing out their consoles that had plugins that could live track, and you got more digital. Things definitely got more digital those days with the Midas consoles and stuff like that. And then also Behringer and a lot of the other guys bringing out wireless stuff, and the way you're able to mix on an iPad, that sort of all changed. The recallability, how digital things have gone, definitely. I remember I was at Woodford I was mixing for a band called The Good Ship. Was it Good Ship? Yeah, they were playing. They were like an 8-piece, man, and like here I am on a little 16-channel Allen and E trying to get something going, and trying not to have the feedback yet the brass section's louder than the vocals, and it's all a balancing act with live. And even at that year, I remember Arrested Development played, and I don't know who was doing the sound, but essentially all you could hear was the kick drum, and the rest of it was getting drowned out.
Yeah, right.
So I think. Live sound has definitely improved. People have better expectations these days. I think the studio scene has definitely evolved in such a big way. I mean, so many people are doing stuff from home now. COVID really made that happen.
It's a lot more accessible these days.
Yeah, it's a lot more accessible. But I also think some of the quality in the music has definitely gone backwards a little bit. I think one of the things that I did learn, and I was really lucky. I got to learn on my feet. I had people like Braden Williams who ran Three Monkeys and was doing stuff for Sony, and he's one who was working in Sydney. He was doing Three Monkeys studio in Sydney, which is contracted by Sony to be a head office, and he got to work with everyone from Snoop Dogg through to Beyonce. And some of the techniques he taught me, as far as he'd run a head in the control room and run it out to a cab into the next room, and then we were doing one. We were doing a session with. Sarah from the Super Jesus, she was supposed to come in and do vocals, but the session players they had in Sony, he showed me techniques that just blew my mind. The level of layering and that sort of Phil Spector wall of sound stuff that they did in the studio was just phenomenal. As I said, they'd have 3 heads hooked up. They'd go into a Mesa Boogie, which I ended up buying off Brad at the Mesa Boogie cab in the other room. And then basically he'd have a session guitarist, Chris, who was the guitarist for Altian Childs from, I think, Australian Idol or whatever. And essentially he'd have like 8 guitars, different guitars, a humbuckers, a Les Paul. He'd have, more aggressive, and he'd have strats as well. He'd have single coils. He'd have all sorts of stuff. And then essentially he'd just pull out each guitar what it's appropriate, and he'd start doing a chug layer, and then he'd do the main riff layer that was a single coil, and then he'd do a counter melody that was running on the single coil on the bottom one, or then he'd do a really hot humbucker or whatever else is happening, and that'd be that was how they did the guitar layering, and they'd be doing 30, 40, 50 tracks as guitar layers and getting that full wall of sound. So once you had good drums and a great bass track and doing those guitar layers, that's when you saw the real production, which I find doesn't happen as much today with people in a home studio. They'll sort of, I encourage people that I've taught who they're in studios producing to at least do 4 tracks for rhythm and all the rest of it. But I don't think that level of elaborate layering goes on. There's some of the techniques I feel that are getting lost in big studios, converting down to home studios. I think that's a big one. And also vocal layering when it comes to BVs. I was always of the firm belief that there was only a couple of things that was mono-panned, and you'd get, a really great, you'd do your vocal comp and you get a vocal take and you have your kick snare, that it was middle panned, and everything else essentially did that sort of Joseph Pugh or even Chris Lord Alge, was very big on when you mix everything else is sort of stereo and you're layering it that way. And so whatever you do, you want at least 2 of each track, so you can do that in the stereo field, and then have something, have the vocal and the kick and the snare sitting in the middle, and that's how you create a cleaner mix. Plus that leans more towards if you're doing mastering and learning how to do things like mid-side and all the rest of it. So
you've touched on a bunch of different experiences and eras there, which leads us nicely into something that we ask everyone that comes on the podcast. So first of all, from your perspective, where do you think the Sunshine Coast music scene historically has done quite well?
The Sunshine Coast scene's done historically quite well with obviously acoustic, more sort of surfy music and sort of more reggae and sort of funk styles. I think that's, and it's a real pity to be, as we speak, sort of losing Soul Bar and the like, because they were, instrumental in really getting the scene sort of happening, especially with live music. And, Brian and I haven't always seen eye to eye, but he was definitely doing well with booking artists and, all that kind of stuff. So, and it was Mel, is it Mel? Yeah. And Mel, they've been doing, there was quite a scene there that we were talking about just a little while ago that, just about every band aspired to play on the Sunshine Coast. I also think Pico and what he was doing with the Pineapple Festival, he was doing great work there, and we did a number of projects with Pico, or tried to. And he was massive for the scene. It was a pity when he took a bit of a hiatus, but it looks like he started up again, which is really good. Good work to Pico, props to him.
Yeah, so that's historically. So if we come to the present, what do you think is genuinely working well for the scene now as it stands?
Well, I mean, that's a tough one, because the big one always for any music scene is grassroots, and I've never felt like the Sunshine Coast has had enough experience, had enough support grassroots wise. I think I told you that story a little while ago, even today when we were talking. We did Big Sound. We were one of the first sponsors of Big Sound. Did a lot with Q Music, and I was involved with Big Sound for probably about 10 years, from 2012 onwards or something. I don't know, something like that. Anyway. And I always noticed that the Gold Coast always had such a healthy scene. They always had their own stage and everything else. Obviously Brisbane, they were showcasing Brisbane artists, and the Zoo were doing well with, any of the Brisbane artists. And there was always in behind, I forgot the name of it now, but it was the little church. I can't remember what it's called now. But, they had, I was in behind Rick's too. I think essentially the Gold Coast had their own stage, and we really pushed and lobbied for the Sunshine Coast Council to get one going, and we never ever actually got a stage going until I stopped doing, Heliport closed down, and we stopped being involved with Big Sound as much, and that was a real pity for me. I mean, we managed to get some of the delegates one year to come up, and essentially the council took them surfing, and it was like, even the delegates said to us, what are they doing taking us surfing? We can go surfing anywhere. We came to see the Sunshine Coast scene, and weren't getting shown the scene, and I think there's been a certain element of blindness that local government has not put enough in, especially with the Sunshine Coast. It's always felt like the poorer cousin of the Gold Coast and Brisbane, and that's a big thing. And I think, have you asked me the one about the future? I think that's where the...
So that was, yeah. So, that leads us, what you were just talking...
Do you want to sit here?
What we're just talking about leads into the next question, I guess, is every scene has its pressure points. And so what do you think the biggest gaps are in the Sunshine Coast scene? Obviously, we just spoke about the stuff with Big Sound.
Yeah.
But yeah, what sort of gaps do you think, or challenges that there are on the Sunshine Coast with the music scene?
Yeah, I think there's some massive challenges. Obviously, you've got Soul Bar used to do open mic nights, which it can't be overstated how important they are for local artists to get in there and even just get some experience in front of a crowd, it's funny because I originally started being a music producer because I wanted to do my own music career, but in the end I ended up being behind the scenes and getting all that happening. I still did some recording of my own, but getting up there and getting some crowd experience is such an important thing for so many of the artists that I especially was starting out there. And some of them are really talented. I had guys like Jason Daniels and stuff who was amazingly talented. I think he had to sort of basically move away from the Sunshine Coast to get any real traction. But, he started off doing open mics at Soul Bar and stuff like that. I think, Kings Beach, and I think Dave from Hostile Entertainment, he does pretty well when it comes to the heavier stuff. I think as far as the Sunshine Coast, some of the heavier stuff and the more sort of beachy music, but any of the stuff in between, not so much. I think the hip-hop scene sort of leaves a bit to be desired. There's no real venues to do that with. And from what I'm hearing, there's going to be a venue that's going to be further down the coast that they're trying to set up to be a major festival venue. But that to me says, yeah, okay, that'll be great for any of the bigger touring stuff, and maybe Pico will move the pineapple from the big pineapple down there, but maybe he won't. But which is not a bad venue in itself. But there'll be a massive gap between what local artists can get there. It'll end up being just sort of internationals, and that's basically it's going to be. Or you'll have to have a bigger name and be getting traction somewhere else in Australia to do that. I think there's definitely a blindness on the Sunshine Coast scene to the local artists. I mean, we've got a whole lot of buskers up and down Mooloolaba and stuff, but there's no real avenues to get further up and happening. Especially on the Gold Coast, they've got other venues and stuff. Like I remember I recorded an album for a guy named Jackson Dunn, who, he's a Filipino artist, and he tours around Australia, but, the Gold Coast always had these little venues that he was gigging constantly, that he could be doing, afternoon sessions just about everywhere and getting paid, and then sort of step it up to maybe a bigger venue. I don't think the venues are that as interested in that anymore, or you're doing, you're getting local venues like the RSL that are basically just doing cover bands because no one wants to hear original music. I think that's where the real problem lies.
Well, so looking ahead though, what do you think, what hope do you have about where the Sunshine Coast music scene is going, and do you see yourself playing a role in that?
Whether I see myself playing a role in that, I'm now focusing more on sort of film and video at the moment, just because I feel there's not as many opportunities around here to sustain a career up here. But my hope is for the future that this new venue, the talk of what's happening with 2032 Olympics and the like, that there is more investment, especially in the grassroots, that gives people capability to get up there. I was at the J for a couple of years doing a radio show that was trying to promote local music. I really tried to push that. We don't even have sort of radio stations that are doing a lot of local music. Obviously, nationally, you've got people like Triple J and stuff, but they're selecting their own select amount of people. There's no real avenues that are, but I'm hoping with things like these big venues and the possibility of bigger events coming to the Sunshine Coast, that there will be a bit more of a resurgence. It's a real pity to see, like I'm wearing this Torella shirt, and it's a real pity to see things like Torella closing down and things like the Night Quarter, or it's now named something else, but that's closing down. Any of those mid-sized venues, I think, is going to be a real problem. I think that's where I hope the future there's going to be a couple of big players that move in and people start going out a lot more, or there's some other way to do it. I mean, we were doing live telecasting stuff, streams to YouTube and Facebook and stuff with Maddie from Dark Cell did a couple from the studio and the like. I think maybe there needs to be more of that. I don't know what we do to overcome that gap between grassroots and even, as I said, more open mic nights would be great, but
Just having the venues to be able to...
And the venue's willingness. I mean, there's venues here. It's just not many of the venue managers really give a shit about live music, That's the thing. That's the real pity about Soul Bar. They had a dedicated live section, and you went there to see live music.
Yeah, for sure.
They did that, And there's a couple of places like that, but not a lot, Kings Beach does a bit of that, I know Dave from Hostile's doing the Green Room up at Yamundi. You've got the Imperial at Yamundi, so they really kind of try and push it, but...
A couple of little micro venues like the Nook up at Karoy started up. There's that sort of backyard BYO venue sort of thing.
Nambour put $20 million into the square, and they're looking at trying to do something like that. We'll see how that turns out. We don't know what the face of that looks like at the moment. The renovations are going on at the moment, but whether that turns into something, that would be promising.
Oh well, in terms of your the role that you'll see yourself playing, I guess hopefully we can see you at least as a mentor.
Yeah, and look, I'm still mixing and stuff when jobs come up. It's just the budgets have been getting smaller. It's pretty funny. Like in the old days, you know, there's the story about Mike Chapman, who lives in Yamundi, but, you know, he did My Sharona. He got given $250,000, you know, recorded it on $50,000 and gave, I don't know, 200,000 back or something ridiculous like that. But it got to the point where, you know, people were, you know, essentially expecting me to record a single that they're going to launch on radio for $2,500, or it even got smaller than that. In the end, people were saying, "Oh, can we get a 14-track album done for $10,000?" Well, it depends. Quality has to suffer at some point.
Yeah, you got to find that, and I think that's where the home studio thing comes in. People find that mix.
Well, yeah, and I mean, as long as they keep in mind, or people keep playing together live, because, you know, as I was joking about today, you know, the bridges disappeared out of music now, and, you know, things are basically loops because of the way we do digital instead of analog. It's, you know.
Very cool. Well, thanks very much for your time today, James. Before we wrap it up, we finish every episode the same way. We'll get the guest to bring to us a song from a local Sunshine Coast band or artist. So can you tell us the song that you've chosen and the artist and why you've chosen them for us today?
Yeah, okay. Well, it was funny. I got a text a little while ago from Toby, who helped me with this session. Done obviously heaps of sessions, over a decade worth, but these guys, you just knew straight away they were going to make it to start with. The song is Gold, and it's by a band called the Dreggs. And Toby rang me up or texted me the other day saying, "Oh, we should be, I think we've hit gold album status, and, you know, we should be getting some numbers or something. Should we check it out if we can see if Ari will give us a gold record?" I don't really care about the gold record, but what I do remember about this session is these guys were just so talented. There was Zach and Pat, I think it was, and essentially, I started doing a session, and I'd be suggesting something, "Oh, dude, I can hear some percussion on this, I can hear that," and I'd just get ready to find a sample or, you know, find some way of playing it in. And he's going, "Oh yeah, we can do that, and have you got bongos?" And we'd throw him a bongo drum, and he'd just get it right the first time. And then, "Oh, bass, yeah, I can do that, mate, no worries." And they were just so talented to start with guitars and the vocals and their harmonising, the way he was going with that. But then essentially everything I threw at him, I'd literally like think of ideas and say it, and they'd come up with their own version of it. And there's a bit in the song where he's doing like multiple harmonies, and there's a big build crescendo to the end, and it's such a great song, and it was just such a really amazing session to record that day, because, you know when you're in the studio with some really talented guys, when there's basically no barriers, there's no, hey, like I remember with some of the other guys from bigger labels, you know, the label would go, "Oh no, we're just getting a session player in to do that," you know, because he says he plays every instrument, but he doesn't really. Whereas these guys literally essentially did, and they were just, it's such a beautiful song too. So yeah, Gold by the Dreggs.
All right, we'll leave a link to that in the description of whichever platform you're consuming this podcast on, and go and check it out. Yep. Thanks very much, guys.
Thanks for having me.
Pleasure.
Thank you.